Okay, now let's continue our discussion. So we have discussed a number of concepts to date, and they are related to the management evolution as a concept. Okay, starting from the ancient period, and we are now expecting management as a discipline has evolved. Okay, so we have also discussed the social theories that are related to management, because the scholars also suggest that management is part of the body of knowledge in social theory. Okay, and we in the previous session we discussed the institutional theory. Okay, so we specifically have discussed the cultural aspect of the institutions, which is part of the informal institution. Okay, so let's have a look at the next one here. Right. So after we discussed about the informal institutions, that basically contains informal rules that affect our behavior as social actors in the in our social system. Okay, and these informal aspects basically change slowly. Okay, now let's discuss the formal institutions that include the politics, our legal system, and also the economics. Okay, and experts suggest that the formal institutions change faster. We can change the formal institutions faster than the informal institutions. Okay, right. So let's look at the political systems that basically refer to the rules of the game on how a country is governed politically. Okay, so that affects the way we operate in a business. Okay, that affects how our organization operates. Okay, and the system, the political system that we adopt, such as democracy system or totalitarianism system, basically affect how we operate. Okay, and actually, from the business perspective, that presents certain political risks. Okay, which is basically associated with the political changes that may negatively impact our operations. Okay, either if we operate in domestic market, that may affect our operation, and also the if we operate in overseas market, that may also be a risk for us. Okay, from a political system perspective. Okay, now you can also always debate whether Australia, from political risk perspective, is quite low or high. Okay, depending on which perspective that you also present, that you also adopt. Okay, and the data that you research. Okay. And yes, we adopt a democratic system where we do not shed blood when we change the government. Okay, but we also say that we change the government or prime minister quite often, and you can also argue that the risk is therefore quite high. Okay, and on the other side, in the totalitarianism system, you can always argue that the political may be stable, the political system may be stable, the leadership is probably stable. And with that kind of system, normally everything is managed by the state, and you can also argue whether the state has the capability to manage the economy. okay, the production and distribution of goods and services for the consumers, okay. And in that kind of system, they normally adopt the communism system, where they actually allow the state to control everything, okay. Except, of course, we also observe a different model in the case of China, okay, when it comes to reviewing the political system, okay. All right, so now let's move on. Legal system. We actually talk about the formal rules of the game, on how the country's law are enacted and enforced. Okay, so how the country's law are enacted and enforced. That is quite interesting as well for us. Okay, in terms of how they affect us. Okay. Here we have three traditions, broadly speaking. When it comes to legal system, we have the civil law, where we provide the legal in the civil law, a legal tradition that uses comprehensive statutes and codes as a primary means to form legal judgments. Okay, so they have got that kind of codifications, if you like, when it comes to the legal system. And common law, which is adopted by Australia, a legal tradition that is shaped by precedents and traditions from the previous judicial decisions. Okay, and the third tradition is the theocratic law, a legal system based on religious teachings. Okay, again, one of the things I'd like to highlight when it comes to the institutional context analysis is basically to look at the impact to business. Okay, and in the legal systems as well, we also we can also look at the property rights, which is basically the legal right to use an economic property or resource and to derive income and benefits from these rights. Okay, and the IP rights, or the intellectual property rights, that basically reflects the rights associated with the ownership of intellectual property, patents, copyrights, and trademarks. Okay, so that is actually organized in the intellectual property rights. Okay, right now, going forward, we actually look at the economic systems now, where we have the private enterprise system, or the capitalism system, the system that we adopt in Australia. It actually reflects an economic system that rewards the actors, or us, in terms of the ability to meet the customer's demand. So if we can fulfill the customer's demand better, we have the right to claim our rewards. Okay, and in our system, we minimize the role of the government. Okay, so here we use the term minimize because it doesn't mean that the government doesn't do anything. They also have their own roles in our capitalism system. Okay, so they regulate. Okay, they produce the legislation. Okay, or they become the lawmakers. These laws that they produce basically set up the rules of the games, as we discussed before. Okay, and in terms of the role of the government as well, from economic management perspective, they also step into certain industries or products or services that require massive investments, where the private sector cannot afford. Okay, so through the taxpayers' money, the government step in to pay for or to finance those investments. Okay, so for instance, if you look at the Andean system, for instance, okay, the as a country, we need a we need the internet network, and the government step in to fund the investments. Okay, and on the other side, we also have the communism system or command economy, where it is actually controlled by the state. Okay, so everything is decided by the state. Okay, and you can contrast that with the private enterprise system or the capitalism system. Okay, right. So just briefly, in terms of the economic system, there was a debate actually between the scholars who support the capitalism system and also the scholars that support the communism system. Basically, those who support the capitalism system suggest that the economy will, the capitalism system has its own method to drive the economic growth. Okay, and that method actually refers to the entrepreneurship that drives the innovation in the organization. Okay, and therefore, to refute the scholars who support the communism system, they mentioned that the economy will always grow. Okay, now which side that you take depends on how you research it actually. Okay, but for us, from the management perspective, what's important is actually to understand the impact of the economy, the impact of the economic system that we adopt. Okay, therefore, as we discussed before, the formal institutions or the institutional context affects the way we behave in the organization. Okay, but and also it affects the organizations as the social actor. Okay. All right, and the next one is if you again, you can contrast the private enterprise system and the state ownership, the private ownership enterprise and also the state ownership enterprise. These two are two different types of enterprise. Okay, the first one is basically owned by the private sector, and the second one is owned by the state. And in our country, in Australia, we have some state-owned enterprises have been privatized, and there are always debates, the pluses and minuses. Okay, so you can look at the energy sector, for instance. You can look at transportation system. You can look at telephone industry, and also and some other sectors as well. Okay, and always, we can always have a good debate about it. Okay. Okay, so I think more importantly, in terms of looking at analyzing the formal institutions from the economic perspective, is to look at the impact again, the impact of economic situation to the organization or to the business. Okay, in this instance, you can refer to some economic indicators such as the GDP, the inflation rate, okay, the inflation rate, the interest rate, or the RBA rates, if you like, Reserve Bank Australia's rates. Okay, that drives the consumption. Okay, and the taxation, policies, and so on and so forth. Okay, so as part of the economic system. Okay, right. And it is also important to understand that in our system, the capitalism system, we again, we have the right to claim our reward if we can fulfill the customer's demand. If we can fulfill customers' demand. Okay, so therefore, we also need to understand the basic rights that we have as a social actor. Okay, so we have the right to own property, for instance, lease property or rent property. So we have the rights to do so. Okay, so we can operate in the system. Okay, and obviously we also have the right to claim profits because we do well in fulfilling demand of our customers, for instance. Okay, and we also have the right to compete. Definitely, we have the right to compete. We have the right to build our competitive advantage. Okay, and nurture our competitive advantage. Okay, and in saying that, we also have the right to we also have the right of freedom of choice. So we can select our own goal, for instance. Okay, whether we want to set up our own enterprise. Okay, so we become the management team of our own enterprise, or we can select to be an employee and build our career as a manager. Okay, so and the field that we like to proceed based on our capabilities as well. Okay, right. Now, just before we move on to a different part of the institutional theory, I just want to highlight briefly that one of the things that scholars have been talking about when it comes to the formal institutions and informal institutions is the PAST concept. Okay, political, economic, social, culture, and technological. And here we actually discuss about when it comes to analyzing past, we discuss about the impact of business. Okay, and we normally look at the changes. Okay, how they affect the business. Okay, so they are basically the main ones that we want to look at. Okay, now since they give impact to business, okay, there are two perspectives in terms of past, in terms of the institutions. Okay, one perspective suggests that the past forces or the institution is beyond the control. Okay, beyond our control at all. Okay, so this is what we call as the reactive perspective. Okay, therefore, based on this reactive perspective, since it's beyond the control, we say that we need to research and we adjust our strategy. So research and adjust our strategy. Okay. The second one is proactive perspective in terms of managing the institutions, institutional context. Okay, especially past. This perspective actually suggests that macro environmental forces or the institutional context is basically partially controllable. Okay, not everything is beyond our control, but we can control some of them, or we can at least influence. Okay, partially we can influence them. Okay, we can influence. Right. Now, so what do we do? Well, we research those past forces, those macro environmental forces. Okay, and after we research them, we try to influence them. Okay, we try to influence. How do we influence the institutions? Well, we can stage media events, we can stage public opinion, okay? And we can also negotiate to the politicians, for instance, okay? And we can, as a firm, you may also recall that some companies may allocate some funding to certain political parties, for instance, okay? Or we can also say, well, I'm not going to vote for you anymore in the next coming election, okay? Or yes, I will still support you in the next coming election because your mission is basically similar to what I need, for instance, okay? So yes. There are some actions that there are some perspectives that we can also adopt when it comes to there are a couple of perspectives that we can adopt when it comes to institutional context. Okay, now This institutional context or the institutional theory actually has evolved as well. And you may recall that one of the concepts that you also need to include in your assessment is the legitimacy. Okay, so the institutional context actually has been developed into the legitimacy concept as well, to include the legitimacy concept as well. Okay, that reflects the generalized perception that the actions of an entity are in accordance of the norms. Okay, or in a simple word, it is actually the ability of the organization to do what it promises to do. Okay, for the stakeholders, right? That includes the customers. That it also includes the government, the society, the employees as part of the internal stakeholders. Okay, and the shareholders, right? So it is the ability of this organization to deliver what they promise, okay, or to walk the talk, basically. So that's legitimacy. Okay, there are a number of studies actually that shows organizations also needs to show they can do that. Okay, you may recall that some organizations receive some criticisms. If you recall the case of VW, for instance, some time ago, when the engineers in America found they manipulate the data for the emission that their cars produce at a time, that actually challenged their legitimacy in that aspect. Okay, and you can also recall a number of cases as well when it comes to the legitimacy. And of course, if we get the as an organization, if we have strong legitimacy with where our stakeholders suggest that we are good in what we do, we deliver what we promise, then it is actually the foundation for us to build a strong reputation that is part of our resources. Okay, right. So that's the institutional theory, as we discussed before, and again, that provides us with the institutions, right? Both formal and informal institutions. Now, the next one is the social capital theory. Okay, that is actually about the individual and collective network that contributes to the organization's performance. Okay, so that look, there are several scholars that dedicate themselves in the social capital theory. Okay, but there are two main ones here. For instance, Bird perspective, which is basically bridging the structural holes. That's what he suggested actually. So he actually suggested that those who have got the strong social capital actually have the opportunity to win the competition better. Okay, and the second perspective is actually Coleman's perspective, where he suggested the bonding view. So, in other words, he focuses on the relationship develops between actors through frequent interaction. So, because we meet and we interact with these people, that will promote a strong relationship or stronger bonding with these people. Okay, so if you look at that, some scholars suggest that the Bird's perspective, the bridging structure holes, normally reflecting the external relationship, the external network, whilst Coleman's perspective has been labeled as the internal bonding, internal ties. Okay, but both of them you can also look at the number of ties. Okay, strong and weak ties, and also close network in the organization. Okay, right. So you may also recall that in the previous session that the social theorists like Gabriel Tardy, for instance, suggest that tardy challenge the institutional context or the institutional theory that suggests that all social actors' behavior is influenced by the institutions, right? By the rules, formal, informal rules, right? And yes, we accept it, and but studies also suggest that we, with our relationship, okay, with our network, okay, we also have the opportunity as a social actor. We also have the opportunity to influence the institutions, right? Because the interactions that we make as social actors basically generate strong power, and therefore birds actually suggest that the social capital is the modern, is the non-conventional, if you like, the non-conventional resources that the organization has. Okay, traditionally, the organization to compete in the industry, the organization must have the financial resources, okay, and equipment or technological resources. Okay, with financial resources, we can have the other things. We can acquire talent resources and also land building and so on and so forth. Okay, but Bird proposed that well, we also need to consider social capital as another resources as well. Okay, right. Now, the next one is the resource-based view, which is basically understanding the strategic resources that provide the organizations to develop an opportunity to build their competitive advantage. Okay, because of the resources that they have, the organization can capture the opportunity, and they can also build their competitive advantage. Okay, in fact, if we think if we step back a little bit, when we set up a firm, for instance, okay, so we actually need to look at the resources, which is one of the things that one of the key aspects that we need to consider. Of course, we need to assess the opportunity, and after that, we also need to assess the resources. Okay, right. Now, this is a brief summary. So the management field has evolved as we've discussed, okay, in this presentation, and this will keep progressing as researchers and business practitioners keep building the knowledge based on the current knowledge. Okay, so we keep evolving. Okay, we build on. Okay, right, and that's basically our session tonight, and we are going to continue with the next topic.